Welcome to House of Horrors. A place where real stories, dark encounters, and unexplained events come to life. Before starting today's video, tell us in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it there so we know from which state people are watching from. Tonight, we're exploring 5 disturbing Texas ghost towns with dark histories, places where witnesses swear the past still watches, still moves, and still remembers who walks in. The Silence of Lobo, Texas. Lobo, Texas does not appear on most modern maps, and if it does, it's usually marked as nothing more than a historical footnote. The town sits along an old stretch of railroad track in far west Texas, surrounded by flat desert and endless sky. There are no fences, no warning signs, and no clear indication that anyone ever lived there. But locals know the place, and they avoid it. Not because it's dangerous in any obvious way, but because something about Lobo refuses to feel empty. I first heard about Lobo from a retired railroad worker I met in Pecos. He mentioned it casually while talking about old steam routes, but when I asked if it was worth visiting, he stopped mid-sentence. He stared down at the table for a long moment before saying that people still saw lights there sometimes. When I asked what kind of lights, he shook his head and said it didn't matter. Then he told me not to go near the schoolhouse after sunset. Lobo was founded in the late 1800s as a railroad water stop. Steam engines needed a reliable place to refill, and a handful of families settled nearby to support the workers. The town never grew large. At its peak, fewer than 100 people lived there. There was a general store, a few small homes, a church, and a one-room schoolhouse. When steam engines were phased out and diesel took over, the trains stopped coming. Within a decade, the town emptied. By the early 1930s, Lobo was abandoned. I arrived in the early afternoon on a clear day, parking my car along the dirt road and walking toward the remains of the town. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not the peaceful quiet of the desert, but something heavier. Even my footsteps sounded wrong, as if the ground absorbed sound instead of reflecting it. There was no bird activity, no insects, no distant hum of traffic. Just stillness. Most of the buildings had collapsed long ago, leaving behind little more than stone foundations and rusted debris. One structure, however, was still standing. The old schoolhouse sat slightly apart from the rest of the ruins. Its walls were weathered, its windows broken, and its door hung crooked on its hinges. It looked abandoned, but not erased. Inside, dust coated everything. Desks lay overturned, their legs broken. The chalkboard still hung on the wall, stained and cracked. When I stepped closer, I realized there was writing on it. Names. Children's names. Some were written lightly, others pressed hard into the slate. Several had been crossed out. One name stood out, carved deeper than the rest, Evelyn. The chalk itself was old, but the grooves were sharp. Not softened by time. It looked like someone had written the names with force, long after the school had closed. I took photos and stepped back, suddenly uneasy. Outside, the sun began to sink lower, and the temperature dropped quickly. Shadows stretched across the dirt in long, unnatural lines. That's when I heard the bell. It rang once, faint but clear. Not a church bell. A small one. The kind used to signal children. I turned, expecting to see movement, but the town remained empty. The bell rang again, closer this time. My phone lost signal completely, even though I'd had service earlier. I started walking back toward my car, my pace quickening. That's when the lights came on. A warm yellow glow appeared inside the schoolhouse, steady and unmistakable. It moved past the windows, slow and deliberate, like someone walking with a lantern. There was no power source. No wiring. No explanation. I froze, watching as the light paused at one window, then drifted toward another. The bell rang again, sharper now, almost impatient. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys. When the engine finally started, I glanced back one last time. The lights inside the schoolhouse went out all at once, plunging the building back into darkness. Later, I searched through county records and old newspapers. In 1913, a fire broke out in the schoolhouse during a winter storm. The teacher and several children were trapped inside. Official records listed 5 deaths. Local accounts suggested more. The building was never rebuilt. Classes never resumed. People passing through Lobo after dark have reported bells ringing, lights appearing, and the sound of footsteps inside the schoolhouse. No one has ever found evidence of trespassers. No one has ever stayed long enough to investigate. I still have the photos of the chalkboard. When I zoom in, I can see faint tally marks carved behind the names. I don't know what they were counting. I only know that Lobo is not as empty as it looks, and whatever remains there has been waiting a very long time to be remembered. The hanging town of Indian Creek, Texas. Indian Creek, Texas, was never large enough to matter to the outside world, and that may be why what happened there was allowed to fade into obscurity. The town sat along a narrow stretch of land north of the Brazos River, surrounded by scrub, mesquite, and slow-moving water that turned black at night. Today, Indian Creek exists only as broken foundations and a cluster of old oak trees standing where the center of town once was. I learned about Indian Creek while researching abandoned settlements in Texas. The name appeared briefly in county records, usually followed by the word vacated. No clear explanation was ever given. When I asked locals near the area about it, their reactions were almost identical. They knew the place. They didn't like talking about it. And they warned me not to go near the trees by the creek after sunset. Indian Creek was founded in the 1890s by farming families and small traders. Life there was harsh but stable. The creek provided water, the land produced just enough to survive, and the town supported itself quietly. That changed when tensions began to rise over theft accusations and rumors of violence. Law enforcement was distant, and justice became something handled by the community itself. When I visited the site, the remains were barely visible. The outlines of buildings were marked only by scattered stones and rotting fence posts. The creek still ran where it always had, its surface slow and reflective, carrying a faint smell of decay. Near the water stood several large oak trees, older than the town itself. Their branches stretched outward in unnatural shapes, thick and twisted. As I walked closer, I noticed strips of fabric hanging from the branches. They were sun-faded and brittle, tied in deliberate knots. This wasn't trash carried by the wind. Someone had placed them there intentionally. Beneath the trees, the ground was bare and compacted, darker than the surrounding soil, as if it had been disturbed repeatedly over many years. I stood there long enough to notice something else. The air felt heavier beneath the trees. Sound seemed muffled, distorted. My footsteps didn't echo the way they should have. Then I saw the marks in the bark. Vertical grooves, darkened with age. Rope burns. Historical records later confirmed what locals had hinted at. Between 1897 and 1904, Indian Creek became known for carrying out its own form of justice. At least 9 people were killed by hanging, all without trial. Official documents referred to them as incidents. Newspapers called them necessary actions. No graves were marked. No names were memorialized. As the afternoon faded into evening, the temperature dropped sharply. The fabric strips began to move, twisting slowly, even though the air around me was still. I heard a long creaking sound, like rope tightening under strain. It came from above. I looked up and felt my chest tighten. The branches overhead were bending downward slightly, as if bearing weight. The air beneath them seemed distorted, forming vague outlines where nothing should have been. Shapes at different heights, swaying gently. The creaking continued, joined by another sound. Dry coughing. Strained breathing. Multiple voices, all struggling for air. I backed away slowly, unable to look anywhere else. The moment I turned to leave, the sounds intensified. The branches groaned louder, and I heard something drop into the water behind me. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car. When I looked back toward the creek, the trees were still. The fabric strips were gone. The land looked empty again. Later that night, I read an article from 1904 describing the final hanging. Afterward, several families reported hearing sounds at night near the creek. Rope noises. Footsteps. Voices calling out. Within 5 years, most residents had abandoned Indian Creek. The town didn't disappear because of drought or economics. It disappeared because the land remembered what happened there. And even now, the trees by the creek are still holding something that was never allowed to rest. The last census of Dry Hollow, Texas. Dry Hollow, Texas, doesn't appear on most maps anymore, but it still exists in county records under an unsettling category, unresolved abandonment. The town was built in the early 1900s around a limestone quarry and a short-lived rail spur that cut through West Texas scrubland. At its peak, Dry Hollow had a schoolhouse, a general store, a boarding home, and just over 200 residents. By 1936, every single one of them was gone. I first heard about Dry Hollow from a retired surveyor who warned me that the town emptied itself. Not collapsed, not evacuated, not destroyed. Emptied. He said the Land Survey Office stopped sending crews there after repeated complaints that the numbers never matched what they saw. Dry Hollow sat in a shallow basin surrounded by low ridges. Wind moved constantly through the area, producing a hollow whistling sound that gave the town its name. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was how intact everything was. Houses still stood upright. Doors were still attached. Windows were broken, but not shattered violently. It looked like a place people had left calmly, locking up behind them, expecting to return. The general store still had shelving inside. Rusted cans lay scattered on the floor, labels faded but readable. In one corner sat a wooden counter with tally marks carved into its surface. Dozens of them. I assumed they were inventory counts until I noticed they were grouped in clusters of 5, scratched deep and uneven, as if made in a hurry. The town records describe a strange problem that began in 1934. Census workers reported inconsistent population counts. One document listed 214 residents. Another, filed just 3 months later, listed 227. No births were recorded during that period. No new families moved in. The numbers kept increasing without explanation. Residents began complaining that they were being counted when they weren't home. Men returning from quarry work found census slips pinned to their doors with their names marked as confirmed present. One woman wrote that she received 2 census notices on the same day, both claiming they had already spoken to her. When I entered the old boarding house, I felt an immediate pressure in my ears, like a sudden altitude change. The hallway was narrow, lined with doors on both sides. Every door had a number painted on it, but beneath the paint, older numbers were visible, scratched out and replaced multiple times. Room 3 had once been Room 7. Room 9 had been 4, then 11, then 6. In the main parlor, I found a ledger lying open on a table. The paper was brittle but readable. It listed names, ages, and occupations. Quarry workers. Teachers. Children. At the bottom of the page, written in a different hand, was a note, "They keep adding themselves." The wind outside intensified suddenly, whistling through the building so loudly it drowned out my own breathing. I heard footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate, paced evenly like someone walking room to room. I stood frozen, staring at the staircase. Dust fell from the ceiling with each step. I called out, expecting silence. Instead, I heard murmured voices. Not words, but the sound of people speaking softly, overlapping, as if conducting interviews. Pens scratching paper. Pages turning. I climbed the stairs despite every instinct telling me not to. At the top, the hallway stretched farther than it should have. The building was small from the outside, but the corridor extended deep into shadow, lined with doors that hadn't been there before. Numbers continued endlessly, painted in different styles, different colors, some dripping as if still wet. One door stood open. Inside was a small bedroom containing nothing but a desk and a chair. Sitting at the desk was a figure made entirely of shadow, shaped like a man wearing a hat. He was writing in a ledger identical to the one downstairs. As he wrote, his hand moved unnaturally fast, flipping pages that appeared to generate themselves. Without looking up, the figure spoke. It read my name. I stepped back, heart pounding. The room behind me filled with whispers. I felt something brush past my shoulder, then another presence, then another, crowding the hallway. The air became thick, oppressive, like standing in a packed room. The shadow finally looked up. Where its face should have been was a blank, featureless void. It stood, holding the ledger open, and extended it toward me. My name was already written inside, along with an age and an occupation that wasn't mine. I ran. I don't remember leaving the building. I remember being outside, gasping for air, the wind screaming across the basin. Every building in Dry Hollow was making noise now. Doors creaked open. Windows rattled. I heard footsteps on porches, voices calling out names, counting aloud. Later research revealed the final census report from Dry Hollow was never completed. The worker assigned to it submitted a partial document before resigning. His last note read, "Population exceeds physical capacity. Residents present without bodies." By 1936, the rail line shut down, the quarry closed, and Dry Hollow was officially declared abandoned. But no deaths were recorded. No graves found. No explanation given. Even now, surveyors avoid the area. Satellite imagery occasionally shows lights where no power lines exist. And if you stand at the edge of the basin during high wind, locals say you can hear voices counting, endlessly trying to finish a census that will never be complete. So guys, that's it for today's story. If this video gave you chills, make sure to subscribe to House of Horrors. New horror stories every day. And yeah, sleep safe tonight.